So, we're going to do something on natural law today, so I thought maybe I would just come out into nature and do the video here. It's a nice snowy day, and it's a little cold, so I'm going to try to do this quickly because I'm not made of ice. So, we're going to talk today about Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, and I'm going to only touch on a little bit of his natural law theory. The idea I have is to connect to just the concept of natural law and human law, and we'll talk in class about the other things, eternal law, divine law. And we'll talk about a few other details about natural law in the process as well. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225. He lived until 1224. So he's a medieval philosopher. He is considered to be one of the greatest minds in Western history. He is pivotal in the history of the Western Church, especially the Catholic Church, but he's had a very strong impact on other forms of the Christian religion, as well as, I think, other religions, and certainly on non-religious areas in philosophy. Aquinas has been so influential, in fact, that you really can't get through a course in the history of philosophy without touching on him. Anytime you want to talk about proofs for the existence of God, or anytime you want to talk about the various doctrinal elements of Catholicism, you have to deal with Thomas Aquinas. So this guy is really important. He had a couple of major works, and the one that we're interested in is his really important opus called the Summa Theologica, the summation of all theology, right? The idea that he had when he was writing it was that he was going to gather together all of the knowledge in the world and put it together into a single work that would just kind of sum it all up. This is the book that he did. It's an unfinished work. He stopped working on it not long before his death, and apparently. And in fact, he wrote it between 1265 and 1274, which was the year he died. Now, the entire work is organized as a series of questions and responses. And this is actually a really interesting thing, because in philosophy, you have to deal with the opponent's view as well as dealing with your own view. And Aquinas does this very systematically. Every time he deals with some element of his theory, the structure is that he starts out with some objections, usually 3 to 5 objections. And then what he does is he has what's called the sed contra. It's on the contrary, right? And what he then does is he basically gives a short statement of his position on the question. After he does that, he then tells you what he thinks. He gives the response, which is the reply. And once he's given the reply, which is usually 3 or 4 paragraphs explaining his point of view, then what he'll do is he'll come to the end of it and he'll give you the replies to the different objections he wrote out, and he'll give them to you one by one by one by one by one. And so it's a very, very clearly structured work, and if you know how to read the Summa Theologica, you can understand it. But if you don't know how to read it, you can actually get confused, because you could read one of the objections and think that that's Aquinas' position when it actually isn't. So this is something worth knowing. So we're dealing with the treatise on law. And the thing that I'm interested in today is the question of the authority of law. What is the authority of law based on? How can we understand where this authority comes from? And for Aquinas, the authority of law is going to come from this connection between the natural law and the eternal law that's in the mind of God. And then the natural law will form the basis for the human law, which is what we're going to be focused on, of course, throughout this semester. So we have the 4 kinds of law. I haven't written down the back of my file here: eternal, natural, human, and divine. The eternal law is the law in the mind of God. The divine law is the law that's been revealed to us specially by God in the scriptures. And the natural law is written in the world. It's written in the universe. And the human law is the law we make up to figure out how we should apply the natural law to our own lives. I'm going to break into the video at this point to add a couple of important elements about the idea of natural law, Aquinas' idea of natural law, and in particular its relation to the eternal law that we find in the mind of God, as well as to the human law that we create to govern ourselves. First, here's a general definition of natural law by Michael Freeman. in Lloyd's Introduction to Jurisprudence, ninth edition, the essence of natural law may be said to lie in the constant assertion that there are objective moral principles which can be discovered by reason. These principles constitute the natural law. Notice that this implies that there is such a thing as moral truth, first of all. Second, that this truth can be known by people. Second, and third, that this truth is actually part of the structure of the universe or the structure of the world. In practice, this could be taken to mean that there are moral principles that are built into the universe generally, that moral values are part of the world, or it can be taken to mean that human nature itself includes moral principles and moral values that humans have to live up to in order to really live according to their own nature. Now, when we look at what Aquinas himself has to say, we find, first of all, that he certainly does believe that a human being, as a rational creature, seems to have access to the eternal law of God. Now, this is not direct access. It's not directly available to us because the eternal law is in the mind of God, and we don't have direct access to God's mind. But Aquinas seems to have thought that it was accessible through the natural law, these moral principles that are part of our nature and part of the universe. So the rational creature, notice that this is based in reason, participates in the eternal reason. Notice that God is being treated as a rational being. The rational creature participates in the eternal reason of God, by virtue of which it has a natural inclination to the activity and end proper to it. And such participation of the rational creature in the eternal law is called the natural law. So if we are rational, we're going to have a tendency to follow the natural law and to operate in ways that reflect our character as rational creatures. Now, once we think about that, it becomes normal to assume that the natural law is going to be the same for everyone because reason is reason and we are all rational creatures. But furthermore, not only do we know the natural law through the use of reason, but it is also part of our nature to be rational ourselves, as I just mentioned. So you see here, those things to which a man is inclined by nature belong to the natural law. And among those things is a property of man to be inclined to act according to reason. As regards the general principles of reason, whether speculative or practical, truth or rightness is, therefore, the same for all. By the way, I'm using the word man to mean humanity only because I'm quoting Aquinas here. Normally, I prefer that we not use gender-specific terminology for gender-neutral concepts like humanity. So there seems to be a sort of virtuous circle going on here. We discover the natural law through reason, and it's part of our nature to be rational. That is, it's part of our nature to use reason to guide our action. And so as we use reason to guide our action, we become more and more able to gain deeper and deeper insight into the natural law, as well as into our own nature, because we're using reason. And so good, right, moral action, good, virtuous action, according to Aquinas and according to many people in the history of philosophy, is actually rational action. So truth or rightness is the same for all. The laws of reason, the laws of logic don't change from person to person, and neither do the rules about right and wrong action. Morality is as universal as truth. Stealing is always wrong, to use an example from the Summa Theologica, even when we think it might be justified. In fact, if we think it might be justified, we are not being sufficiently rational. If we are sufficiently rational, we will see the universality of the prohibition of theft and other things. Finally, this means that whatever else is true of natural law theorists will say that a human law must always be based in the unchanging natural law. If a human law is not based in the natural law, it might not be a law at all. In order for a law to be just, it must be based in natural law. And an unjust law seems to be no law at all, right? As we can see here. Now, in human affairs, a thing is said to be just insofar as it is right according to the rule of reason. But the first rule of reason is the law of nature. Hence, every human law has the nature of law insofar as it is derived from the law of nature. But if it is in any respect at odds with the law of nature, then it will no longer be law, but a corruption of law. Does this justify civil disobedience? We might want to consider that, but at least it underscores one thing, that any legitimate human law must always be based in the natural law. You don't have to be someone who believes in God to believe that natural law theory is correct. But because of Aquinas' influence, natural law theorists tend to be believers in God as a general rule. But it's not a necessary thing, and you could do it without. So Aquinas' viewpoint is teleological. He believes that the natural law points us to the proper place that a human being occupies in the natural world around us. He thinks that it teaches us that we ought to engage with the world in a particular kind of way, and that if we really study the world and apply reason, we will be able to learn what that way is and do the right thing. Everything in the universe tends towards some good. The good, the ultimate good for all of us, is the thing that all of our actions are trying to obtain. This is something we're going to encounter a bunch of times, not only in this class, but in other classes, and you're going to encounter it every time you do anything connected to ethics, political theory. There's going to be this idea that there are not only individual goods that we can obtain, but there's also going to be the ultimate good that everyone should be going for. And that ultimate good, Aristotle called it eudaimonia, which is roughly translated as happiness, but we could also call it a life well lived. He talked about eudaimonia. We can also talk about a right relationship with God. We can talk about participation in the divine, a full connection, proper connection with the universe. But in general today, I want to talk about just generally human happiness. If we pursue the goods that are appropriate to humans, and if we pursue them in the right way, we will attain happiness. Happiness. And that happiness will be sort of really for Thomas and for most of the contemporary natural law theorists, it's going to be really a life well lived. It's going to be eudaimonia in the Aristotelian sense. But I'm going to talk about his happiness. So the good, teleologically, is that thing towards which we all tend. The ultimate good, the highest good, the ultimate thing that gives meaning to human life. That's what we're talking about here. Aside from that, we can talk about a bunch of other things. For example, reproduction and sexuality is part of human nature. It's part of the natural world. Therefore, it's perfectly reasonable that humans would engage in reproductive activities, and that sexuality would be a natural expression of our own selves. Natural law theorists will get into details about that and talk about the right way to be sexual and the wrong way to be sexual. But again, I don't think there's a necessary single perspective on that natural law theory is going to point us towards. It's just that natural law theorists have tended to go in a particular, rather conservative direction on that. Another thing that's going to be a good that we're going to be encouraged to pursue will be self-preservation. Food, shelter, clothing, all of the things that we need to live comfortable lives, to stay alive. I think that this is the kind of thing that John Finnis, who's someone we're going to talk about, calls the value of life, the good of life, that sort of thing. It's connected to all those sorts of things. Another one is going to be knowledge. Truth is very important. We are naturally rational beings, the natural law theorists will tell us, and therefore as rational beings we should be seeking the truth. And we should be seeking to not only know what the truth is, but to live according to the truth. So this is going to be something that's very important. And by the way, when we talk about truth, natural law theorists think that all forms of truth are valuable. So we're not looking just for scientific truth. We're also looking for spiritual truth. We might be looking for metaphysical or philosophical truth. We might be interested in the truths of literature, the deeper truths of human nature and social truth and human society and all those sorts of things. Whatever the type of truth is that we're talking about, it is valuable according to natural law theory. Finally, friendship. We all need friendship. We need social connections and that sort of thing. And this is also considered to be an essential part of being human. To be fully human is to participate in at least these things. And they'll come up with other things as well. One philosopher includes play in recreation and entertainment. One includes aesthetic experience, this experience of beauty, and so on. And so you'll see that these are all things that are very important. Natural law points us towards the need for these things, and then natural law forms the basis for human law. So the content of human law must be reflective of the values that we can derive by observing the universe and drawing out what natural law has to teach us. But connected to that is also the notion that law needs to have a particular structure. And according to Aquinas, all law always has the same basic structure. So, very, very briefly, because we are rational beings, and because the universe has a rational structure, law itself must be based in reason. It can't be random. It can't be just whatever you think. It needs to be rational. It needs to be, you need to be able to lay it out and say why the law is this, what makes this something that we ought to be doing. And it should be based in human nature. Human nature, we are rational beings. Therefore, law itself must be rational because it regulates human behavior. Secondly, law must be for the common good. If law isn't for the common good, then it's not really law. If it isn't rational, it's not really a law. What's the common good? The common good is literally the good of all, the good of the community. Not necessarily the good of every individual, and certainly not the good of one person. So when we're talking about the common good, we're not talking about the good of a certain set of individuals. We're talking about the good for all. And there are various ways of understanding that, but that's what we mean by it. Something else that needs to be true of a rule in order for it to be law is that it must be issued by a person who has the authority to do so and also the duty to care for the community. So if it's for the common good, it has to be issued by somebody who has the authority in that context, in that social context, to issue laws, and that person must have in mind the common good. It must be for the purpose of promoting the common good that this has been done. And again, if it's not put forward by such a person, then it's not a law. And the final thing that needs to be true of it is it needs to be made public. This is promulgation. It needs to be made public. A secret law is not a law. This is the idea in the natural law theory. Laws cannot be secret. Laws cannot be hidden. They cannot be unknown. A law must be publicly knowable. It doesn't necessarily need to be actually known, but it needs to be knowable. You need to be able to know what the law requires of you in order for you to follow the law. If you cannot know what the law requires of you, then that law is not a law. It doesn't apply to you. And so promulgation is very important. And what we understand is that law itself, human law, is justified by its relationship to the natural law if it's drawn from that natural law. And that because the natural law is based on universal, objectively true values and moral principles, those values and moral principles also justify human law and give it the authority that it needs to be able to govern our lives. So, this is a basic introduction to the ideas around natural law and the connection between natural law and human law in Aquinas. And of course, we're going to do more in class. And I've probably gotten some things wrong, and I have, of course, only given part of the story. But I hope that's helpful. So I'm going to get inside now because this natural environment is making me really cold. I'm not going to be able to hold on to these things much longer. So I'll see you later.